I wanted to talk this morning about the dichotomy of following Jesus. Because sometimes, it's like I like anything that has the word dichotomy in it. No, I don't know. The dichotomy of following Jesus, kind of because there's two different ways that people will talk about following Jesus. You'll hear almost what seems to be two kind of opposite mentalities that people will give. The first one is like, it's super easy, like following Jesus is absolutely the easiest thing you can do. You just, pray this prayer and make him your Lord. And then you have verses like Matthew 11, 28 to 30, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burden or heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And so, a lot of times you'll hear like, it's so easy. You just come to Jesus as you are, and you just ask him to be Lord, and you just follow him. And following Jesus is this very simple thing. Then the second way that you'll hear people talk about following Jesus is that it's intense. Like he demands your everything. Following Jesus is not for the timid. It's not for the faint of heart. You have to be willing to die to follow him. He's going to ask everything of you. And then you have verses like Luke 9:23, where it says, "Then he said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me." And of course, we know take up his cross daily is meaning like die. So Jesus, it's kind of weird how you have the same guy saying, hey, come to me because my yoke is easy, my burden is light, and also be prepared to die And so there's this dichotomy, and you very often will hear people kind of go one way or the other. You have many churches that are kind of into the very, it's very easy, it's all about love and stuff like that. And you'll have other churches where it's a lot like, it's more hardcore, like he demands your everything, he demands your all, kind of do this stuff. And it's like, where do you fall in that? And, what's actually the truth? Gen X, I remember, how we do this now where people like are always saying like, what is a generation like? And then you want to cater stuff to it. I can actually remember when I was a teenager in Gen X, hearing the adults having those conversations about my generation and saying like, what? Well, and they were all like, well, Generation X is all about extremes. Like, we don't want to hand them this wimpy, sissified version of Jesus. It needs to be like, give him everything. If you're not going to die for the gospel, then leave the church now. Because they're like, Generation X must like extreme stuff. I'm not sure that everyone was really like that. It kind of worked for me a little bit. I'd like into that. Yeah, man, I'm a radical. I'll do it all in, whatever. Yeah. And also give me a pair of rollerblades because we're Gen X and that's what we do. So, but rather than like looking at and saying it should be this way for these people and this way for this people, what I'd really rather say is like, well, but what is it? Because one thing that the Bible says is God is never changing and he's consistent and that there is no contradictions in him. So I wanted to look at kind of the dichotomy and say, well, what is it? Is following Jesus easy or is following Jesus hard? And the answer is both, which is why it's a dichotomy. So Jesus actually demands everything from us in order to follow him. He wants everything. So there is this radical surrendering of everything. But then once we have done that, he actually then empowers us to live that life, thus making it easy. So we'll go into and explain that a little bit, but it is this thing of if we will surrender our everything to him, which can be hard and sound radical and sound very demanding, then all of a sudden what he gives us back in turn enables us to do it and makes it so that now his burden is light and his yoke is easy. So let's talk about that. Let's start off with, they always say to give the bad news first. So we'll start off with Jesus demanding everything. I don't know if that's bad news. But the verse I read earlier, Luke 9:23, it says, and he said to all, but we're going to read 23 through 25 this time. And he said to all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and let him follow me. For whoever desires to save his life, he will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, this one will save it. For what is it profited? What is it a man profited gaining the whole world but destroying himself or suffering loss? And so in this passage, we see Jesus talking a lot about like losing our lives for his sake. And that is kind of the definition of demanding our everything. Like he wants our life. But in this, when we get beyond the, just take up your cross and follow me, he actually starts listing some things. And he talks about this loss of life, which is really, for us, we're not actually dying, in that, but it's a sense of surrendering of our entire self, giving up the right to control our own life and surrendering that completely to him. And he has some promises here because he says, for the one who tries to save his own life, he's going to end up losing it. But for the one that actually surrenders and gives up his own life, he actually ends up saving his life. And we can look at that in kind of two different ways, because we could look at that in terms of, say, like our heavenly reward, our eternal life in heaven or on the new earth, that kind of thing, and say, well, if we give up our life, if we surrender and have this really tough life here on earth where I just completely abandon everything, which, by the way, it's verses like this is where they get things like taking a vow of poverty, taking vows of chastity, doing things like that. That is kind of where that comes from. It's this idea of I am going to give up everything that's good on this earth so that I can inherit this wonderful eternal life in heaven. But that may not be the exact interpretation that Jesus was intending for this verse. And we'll get into that a little bit as we go on. But he says, what does it profit you if you gain the whole world? In other words, if you live for yourself and you gain the whole world, you get everything. You are Elon Musk. You're famous and you've got billions of dollars and you can just do whatever you want. You can control the outcome of a war with your satellite system. Whatever you want to do, you can do like, like that kind of thought is not even going to occur to me. Oh, I'll just redirect some satellites, whatever. I can change the course of history, but what does that gain if you end up losing who you actually are? We actually sang several songs this morning about who we are. I am who you say I am. I'm not an orphan. I'm not a poor man. Even though sometimes circumstances might feel or look opposite that, there's these promises in God that we're not, or that I'm not a victim. Because I have something greater than just this world. And of course, you can go into, when you start looking at eternity, of course, it even makes more sense too, but we'll come back to that. So this loss of life is about surrender. It's about no longer our will, but his will. It's not our desires, but his desires. Or not our strength, his strength. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He doesn't just stop with saying, if you want to follow me, you have to give me your life. He then goes on and gets kind of specific about aspects of our life that he demands from us. In Matthew 8:21 through 22, it says, and another of his disciples said to him, Lord, allow me first to go away and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. This is a thing where Jesus actually was looking at a disciple and he said, you come follow me. And the disciple says, well, first let me go bury my father. And Jesus is like, no, let the dead bury their own dead. You come follow me. And at first blush, that kind of sounds almost cruel. Like Jesus is like we're just about to have a funeral for my dad. Can I just attend that funeral and then come? And Jesus is like, no. But that's not what was happening here. When he said, let me first bury my father, what he was saying is, my father is healthy and alive right now, doing okay, but I know that a time is going to come when I'm going to have to take care of him. Why don't I get back to the stage of my life where I have no responsibilities, nothing to do, and then I will come follow you. They just spoke differently back then. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't say that. Somebody says, hey, you want to go on a trip? I say, well, let me wait till my parents die. But that's what he was really saying is, let me wait till my parents are dead And then when I have nothing to do, because my kids will all be grown and they're on their own, my parents don't need anyone to care for them because they're dead, then I will come follow you. And Jesus is like, no, follow me now. So Jesus is actually saying that he wants to be above families. Like he's saying, you want to follow me? You need to surrender your families. So first I'm calling you to surrender your life. Now I'm telling you, surrender your family to me. I need to be ahead of that. I want you to consider me before you're even considering your immediate family. In Matthew 19:21, Jesus goes on to someone else and he says, this is a guy who came to him and said, I have obeyed all the law. I've done everything. Is there anything I still lack? And then Jesus turns to him and he says in verse 21, it says, Jesus said to him, if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. And we know from the story and reading this that this was a very wealthy guy that had come to Jesus. And Jesus knew very specifically, because he listened to God well and operated in the gifts of the Spirit, just like we can, but probably had a word of knowledge about this guy, that he liked his money above everything else. He was very comfortable in his wealth and liked, could trust in it. And Jesus is like, I need you to get rid of everything and come follow me. Like, this is not the easy, it doesn't sound like the, hey, my yoke is easy, my burden is light thing. Like, go sell everything you have, become poor, give it all away, and then you'll gain treasure in heaven. You come follow me. Jesus is saying, I want you to sacrifice, and I want to be above your money and your possessions. Like, he's drilling down very specific about where his place is in this line of things. In John 21, verses 18 through 19, Jesus says, he is talking to Peter. And Peter has sort of been asking him a little about what the future might hold for him. And he says to him, most assuredly, I say to you that when you were younger, you girded yourself and you walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. And this he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. In other words, Jesus is saying, I want to be above your plans. I want to be above the things that you've planned out for your life. Because Jesus, in this way, he's saying, like, when you were younger, meaning before you were following me, you could do whatever you wanted. But when you follow me, understand that's not going to be the case anymore. In fact, you're going to be martyred. You're going to be led somewhere you don't want to go. Your hands are going to be stretched out. That is Bible speak, by the way, for stretching out your arms, is Bible speak for crucified. That's what they did. The only time it's not is when they say, like, someone actually literally was reaching for something and they say he stretched out his arm. But other than that, it means being crucified. And so he knew that that's what was going to happen to Peter. And so he says to him, though, but follow me. And so he's saying, you need to have Jesus above your will, your plans, your life. And then he actually continues that, because I didn't put these verses, but I get to verse 22. But in the next few verses, then Peter, after hearing that, goes, well, what about him? Because that's what we all want to do, right? What about that guy? He's looking at John. And Jesus says, if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. And of course, it actually says in the Bible that sparked rumors that John would live forever. But, that's not what Jesus said. He just said, it's not everything.
He was the last one.
Yeah, that's right. He was the last one. Yeah. But anyways, so how others follow Jesus does not affect how we follow Jesus. Because sometimes we want to go, well, what about like, Jesus is calling me to give up all this stuff. What about this guy who's sitting over here? It looks like he's not giving up anything and he's just keep getting blessed and blessed and blessed. What about them? And how others are called to follow Jesus doesn't affect how we're called to follow Jesus. And if another is blessed and we're not, basically Jesus' answer to that is, well, what is that to you? And then he says, you follow me. In other words, Jesus is actually even above fairness. Like, we can't even expect just things to be fair. Or it'd be great if everybody's called and has to sacrifice everything and give up everything and surrender their life. And we all live miserably for Jesus. But what if others aren't and they're happy? Is whatever. Jesus is about fairness. So Jesus is actually getting very specific. There's actually some real stuff in the Bible that's like, hey, following Jesus can actually be hard. He's saying we need to surrender our lives, our money, our time, our plans, our families, all of our priorities. And we do this without concern of how we think he's treating other people. Okay, I'm buying into this, that following Jesus is actually hard. There's a real demand put on my life. Like this, if it kind of stopped there, it would be really hard. I still think it would be worth it because of the sacrifice of what Jesus has done, but it would be really hard. But after asking for our lives, after putting this kind of demand on us, Jesus then does something to make the other side of this true, which is in return of giving our lives to him, he gives his life to us, to be lived through us. And that is actually what's called the Great Exchange. Like if you listen to various preachers or teachers and stuff, a lot of times they'll refer to this as the Great Exchange, that we exchange our lives for the life of Jesus. And sometimes we'll talk about this in the Bible, like he took our sin to give us his righteousness, or he does these things. In John 6:53, Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." Now, most people viewed this as a very harsh saying. In fact, if you continue to follow this, by the time you get to verse 66, after the people question him and find out that he's actually serious about this statement, it says that many of his disciples turned and followed him no more. They couldn't take this. And yet, this is actually one of the best statements in the Bible. Now, it wasn't talking about the 12 disciples, it was about like the 72. He had like 72 disciples that were following him. He had sort of the 12 core. And it was that 72 in that group, people that had seen some amazing things from him. And it says, at this point, they couldn't do it. Wow. So they turned and they followed him no more. And it was actually then that he then turned to his disciples and said, "What about you? Will you go too?" And they said, "Where else will we go? You have the words of life." But in this, the people didn't understand it. They didn't understand the beauty of this verse. That when we sacrifice ourselves, he gives us his life. When it talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, which does sound very cannibalistic and horrible if we don't understand what he's talking about, is that we're taking his blood into us is making us fully righteous before God, so that we now are righteous based on his blood, based on his sacrifice and his work, not on our works. And then by eating of his flesh, it's taking his life to live through us. So it's now his strengths that are in us, his will, his purposes, his thoughts, his stuff that gives us. And that's why I said it's this thing of he turns around and gives us his life. It now empowers us to live that life. So we take his life into us, and he asks to be Lord over our family and to make, he says, "I want to be Lord over your family. I've asked you to surrender your family." But then what does he do? He goes and makes us children, co-heirs with Christ. He makes us family. So he tells us, when he said, "Let the dead bury their own dead," he's saying, you surrender your family to me, but when you do that, I will now make you my family. And your whole family can come and be a part of God's family. He asks us to make him Lord over money and possessions. Give all you have, sell it to the poor, whatever. He doesn't, by the way, that was not a command given to all people. That was a command given to that one person. We weren't called to take vows of poverty, but we are challenged and directed and demanded by Jesus for us to make him Lord over our possessions and our money. And then what does he do in exchange for that? He declares and names himself as our provider. And he says, "I am your provider. I am the one who will bless you. I will pour out my blessings on you abundantly. I will make your cup overflow. So you start to see this pattern of he demands things from us that in return he becomes for us. He asks us to make him Lord over our lives. And instead, he then gives us his life. And he says, and I give you life abundant. In John 10:10, it says, the thief does not come except that he may steal and kill and destroy. But I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. And that's a great verse. Like, that's a good prosperity gospel verse. No, but it's right. But it's a great verse because this is really true. Because Jesus is saying, when you give up your life, my life comes into you. And now you have life. But you have life abundantly. Because Jesus' life is greater than our life could ever be. Jesus' life is far above what our life would ever be without him. And so when we become united with him, it's a far greater life. So it's like that surrender to be turned and blessed. I used to have a pastor, his name is Daniel Williams. And there was a story that he told way too often. But he told all of his stories way too often. But there's one story that he used to tell, and it was some made up story about this. There was this kingdom, and the king was going to come and do a parade through the city. And it was going to be, he was the brand new king, and it was kind of a let's meet the new king kind of parade. And there was a beggar, and he had nothing left. In fact, all he had left was a small bowl of rice, and that was it. And he had figured, basically, I have this rice, and then I'll probably eat this, and then I'll die because I don't have anything else. And so he's like, well, he heard the proclamation that this new king was coming into town. So he decides that, you know what, why not? I'll go out, I'll sit, I'll eat my bowl of rice, see this new king, and then I'll die. And so he goes and he gets into sort of on the front row and sits out there with his small bowl of rice. And all of a sudden, all the noise starts coming, all of the pomp and circumstance and everything. And he starts to become ashamed of his presence. He looks bad and he can see this, just royal procession coming. But he's like kind of ashamed of his appearance. So he just sort of bows his head and just keeps down, and he can feel. Excellent. So as the procession comes, he feels the shadow of everything coming, and he hears the music, and all of a sudden he can feel like the shadows stop. He's looking down, he can see the shadows, he can just feel the whole procession just stops right in front of him. And he's like, oh man, what is going on? And the king gets down off of his horse, and he comes and he stands directly in front of this beggar. And he says, beggar, look at me. And so the guy looks up and he sees the king, and the king says, give me of your rice. I want your rice. And now this beggar, he just starts filling up with rage. And he's like, I cannot, this guy has everything in the world. He's got, money. He's displaying money, just sitting out here, coming in all this royalty. He's the king of it, got everything. And this is the only thing I own in this world is this rice. And he's asking for my rice. But he can't say anything because, kings. So he looks down and he reaches into his bowl of rice, and he grabs the bare minimum he could think of to give him. He grabs 3 grains of rice, and he puts it out, and the king puts his hand in, he puts it in the king's hand, takes it, and the beggar just leaves his bowl on the ground and closes his eyes and just is thinking like, this kingdom is doomed, to have such a greedy, horrible king who would demand of my rice. And then he can feel the procession move on, and he just stays there with his eyes closed, seething as people start to get up and leave. And finally, he decides to get up and leave, and he opens up his eyes, and he looks, and inside of his bowl are 3 gold coins, 1 for each grain of rice that he gave the king. And he said, man, if I had known my king, I would have given him my all. And this is a good example of the demand of Jesus. When we talk about he puts a demand on our life that can feel unreasonable sometimes, that can feel like he's asking for so much. But he then in turn gives us his all. And Jesus' all is greater than our all. We are the ones that just have a bowl of rice to give. And he has the treasures of heaven. And he pours his life into us. In John... in John 13:8, Peter says to him, this is during the Last Supper, and Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And Peter says to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him and says, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." In other words, the very things that Jesus has asked of us, we can't do on our own. Because Peter's like saying, "No, you can't wash me." And Jesus is like, "No, I have to do this. You can't make yourself clean. And you can't clean me." Because this was a symbolic gesture of Jesus. This was not about him trying to teach a servant. He's teaching them about righteousness and that he's cleaning them. And he's like, "And I can do this. I can clean you and you will be completely clean." But what Jesus has asked for us, we cannot do on our own. And he provides the way for us to do it through him. What's the greatest thing that Jesus ever did? I would say that the greatest thing Jesus ever did was rise from the dead. But he didn't actually do it. God did it to him. Jesus simply trusted that he would. When he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," Jesus was trusting that God was going to be faithful to do what needed to be done. But there's nowhere in the Bible where it says Jesus raised himself from the dead. It actually says, in the same spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, God raised Jesus from the dead, the Spirit. Now, I know that gets tricky because we don't have three separate gods. We have one, so don't ask me about that right now. But the point is, Jesus came and lived as a man, and when he died, he was trusting for God. The thing that we credit Jesus, the most powerful thing that he ever did, he didn't actually even do. It was done to him. That's a good picture of our lives. That the most powerful things we will ever do are the things that God will do to us and through us. In Romans 8:11, it says, "But if the spirit of the one having raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, the one having raised the Christ from the dead will also make your mortal bodies live through the indwelling of his spirit in you." Or in other words, the same spirit that raised up Christ from the dead, that empowered him to do the greatest thing that he would ever do, that's far beyond the capability of any person. That's the same spirit that will give us life. He will make our mortal bodies live through the indwelling spirit in us. So he gives us everything. By giving him our all, it shouldn't say it empowers, God can do whatever, but it allows him to give us his all. 2 Peter 1:3 says, "As his divine power has given to us all things pertaining to life and godliness through the full knowledge of the one calling us through glory and virtue." Or in other words, everything we need for life and everything we need for godliness. So everything that you need to live and everything that you need to be perfect has already been given to you. You've become divine or partakers of his divine nature. And so he's given us everything that we need. So when he demands us our all, it's only because he in turn gives us everything that we would then need. And so we don't have to worry. So this is where I say it becomes this dichotomy. He asks us for everything and then in return gives us everything. So yes, there's this high level of demand from Jesus. So the question is following God hard and radical or easy? And the answer is, if you'll do the hard and radical, it's easy. If we will surrender our everything to him, then all we have to do to live the absolute perfect Christian life from that point forward is allow his life to be lived through us. Like, he will do it. And that is one thing I think that a lot of believers really struggle with, is how do I allow the life of Christ to live through me? How do I not strive and do and make this be effort? Like, there has to be effort involved. And the truth is, there is some. Like, when he lives his life through us, it's because there's actually life to be lived, which results in us moving and breathing and talking and doing things, but it's no longer our strength, it's his strength. One of the easiest ways that you can tell if you're living through your own power or if God's living his life through you is by not how physically tired you get when you're doing something that you believe God has called you to, but how spiritually and mentally and everything exhausted you get. Because if it's his strength and his power, then it brings us life. And we go, now you might get tired, but then you go to sleep and you wake up and you're doing okay. I'm not saying that you won't get tired, but I'm saying you won't get fatigued. That's where those who wait on the Lord will run with wings as eagles. They will run, they will renew their strength. They will walk and not grow weary. They will run and not faint. Or run and not grow weary, walk and not faint. They will, because there's this supernatural power that enables us to do it, as opposed to someone who's like, man, I've been serving God for whatever time and I just and I hate it. It's a struggle. It's work. It's effort. Why is it work and effort? And that's a solid question to ask ourselves, and it's a good time to reevaluate. And I don't mean that as a condemnation statement. If you've ever been in that situation, it's a challenging statement to say, are you allowing the life of Christ to live through you in that area? And not just ministry, is constantly looking at finances, bring exhaustion and weariness, is constantly looking at your health become a state of frustration and weariness. Is constantly looking at your family, a state of frustration and weariness. All these things, Jesus said, come to me, take my burden upon you, take my yoke upon you because it's easy. I will give you rest because his strength can go through us. Yeah, we go through the tough times. I mean, Daniel, I believe, was letting the life of Christ live through him. Well, life of God. He was living according to God. Old Testament versus New Testament changes your wording. But, it still had to be scary looking at the lion's den, and some other thing. But yet he faced it with courage and bravery and went in and then came out and everything was fine. And it actually says in the Bible that there were no scrapes, scratches, bruises, or anything on him, which tells me he didn't even attempt to do anything in his own strength. When it says in there that God locked the jaws of the lion, it means he just trusted fully in God. He wasn't scratching, trying to get out, break out, save himself, do something, wrestle the lion. It says, no, he just allowed God to do it. That's a situation that would be impossible for us to do in our own strength. Yet when God did it, it became no effort. And so that's how it is to allow the life of Christ to live through us. The secret to following Jesus is to surrender everything, to actually give it all. Because in return, he gives us all of himself, and his life is greater than our lives ever could be without him. I probably should have added without him at the end of that. But it's the real truth. His life in us is so far greater than our lives without him could ever be. But in order to have that, his life through us, it's surrender. Because fortunately, I don't know, God set things up this way. When he comes in, he doesn't possess us. He doesn't force us to do his will. He doesn't force us to surrender everything. We can say, Lord, Jesus, I make you Lord of my life, and not really make him Lord of each individual aspect of our lives. And he's still in us, but he won't then come in and go, nope, I'm taking over. I now own your bank accounts. I now own everything. He just doesn't do that. What he asks is that we have to continually surrender those things to him, surrender our full lives to him. And that's how, so when we don't do that, we actually find it more difficult to live the Christian life, because now not only do we have to live our own life, but we also have to sort of battle against Jesus, who wants to live his life through us. And so now there's this tension between a struggle of God wanting to do in us and us rejecting him so that we can do our own thing. And we don't want that tension. We just want to relax and allow God to live his life through us. So that is the dichotomy of following Jesus.